Network webinar. Today we're talking about developing the evidence base on what works for children exposed to domestic abuse. And we've got three amazing speakers talking from different vantage points. So we will start with Steph Waddle from the Early Intervention Foundation, and Steph will be talking about an evidence review that the Foundation have just completed. And she'll be talking about the strength of the evidence in this space and potentially, some of the barriers to generating better evidence and more evidence. And then we're going to go on and hear from Hira Hussain from Chain, and she's going to be talking about the potential for using open source resources as a way of building collaboration and hopefully reducing duplication in the sector, because what we see is a lot of intervention development and development of similar interventions and less focus on evaluation of those interventions. And then we're going to finish up with Claire Powell from the Institute of Child Health at UCL. And Claire is going to be talking about the role of outcomes and outcome selection in reducing research wastage, where it's not taken up by evidence users, and the role of outcomes in generating more relevant evidence to the people who need it to inform their decision making. So without further ado, I will hand over to Steph from the Early Intervention Foundation, and just to say that I'll be picking up questions in the chat, and then I'll field them. We have a panel discussion at the end, so I'll collect up questions and then we'll have them at the end. Okay, over to you, Steph.
Thanks, Emma. I'll just share my screen, everybody. Bear with me. Can somebody reassure me that they can see these?
Yeah, all good.
Great. So yes, thank you. So I'm Steph Waddell from the Early Intervention Foundation. And as Emma said, we've been doing some work over the last year to really dig into what we know about what works to support child victims of domestic abuse, what some of the challenges are around developing that evidence base, and crucially, what's the local context? So what are the kind of system factors that are playing in to some of the challenges around evaluation? So I'm going to talk about three strands of our work. So the first one, the kind of simple question really, what do we currently know about what works? And this, to look at this question, we did a review of systematic review evidence. And we supplemented that by a review of the grey literature and a call out for evidence from providers of interventions. And then I'll go on to talk about some work we did to look at the literature around the challenges to impact evaluation and some interviews with some key academics and others in this space. And then, as I say, what's the context, crucially, and how does this affect both evaluation and the use of evidence? So on the first one first, so we looked at programs that were delivered in the UK. We applied some criteria to doing that. So programs that were specifically designed to work with children affected by domestic abuse and had looked at their impact on child outcomes. We then took these through a scoring process and some quality assurance internally to really determine the strength of the evaluation and the extent to which these programs could demonstrate an impact on child outcomes. And if you can make sense of this slide, really the key message is that there's very little impact evaluation for UK programs. So we identified 107 relevant programs in the UK. Only 24 of those had published evaluation at all. And then if you look in the first pie chart shows that we identified only 3 that had what we would call a robust study design. So a study that would permit us to infer a causal impact on a child outcome. So 2 of those were randomized control trials. And so we would describe the evidence there as robust, but the link to outcomes specifically relating to domestic abuse and children's experience of domestic abuse were less well defined. There was one quasi-experimental design, which was the NSPCC START programme, which was the most promising intervention that we identified through this work. So the summary from that first strand for us was, yes, the programmes internationally we found with the strongest evidence had yet to be tested in a UK context. So most of them were tested in the US, where clearly just more resource for randomised control trial or quasi-experimental designs. Many UK programmes have yet to be evaluated, and where they have, these tended to be feasibility studies or internal evaluations. Where we did find evaluations that had been published, there were methodological issues, which ultimately meant that we couldn't attribute any change in child outcomes to the intervention. As I've said, RCTs and QEDs are limited in number. And the evaluations we found commonly weakened by things like small sample sizes, often less than 40, an over-reliance on qualitative data, which of course, whilst important and very useful, can't tell you about impact, high attrition rates, and generally a lack of consideration of long-term change. So tended to look, for example, at before and after, say, an 8-week programme or something like that. So we then took a look at what do we know about the challenges of impact evaluation. So again, a brief look at the literature. Interviews with experts, including Emma, of course, and just to kind of summarise some of these. So there are concerns about RCTs. I think they are contentious in this space. So there's an ethical challenge and some ethical concerns in that the study design requires a comparison group of children. And concerns about withholding a service, also practical concerns about the burden on an already struggling system. Our view is that there are routes to testing effectiveness that are really crucial, that don't result in services being withheld, and we do need to make greater use of these experimental methods because they are the only way to establish causality and to really know that these interventions work. So as I've said, cost and resource implications obviously a big factor here. Emma's mentioned outcomes already, so a lack of consensus on the most relevant and appropriate outcomes to measure, which really hampers attempts to synthesize evidence across studies. And we really welcome the work being led by Claire and by Emma on a common outcome set, which feels a really vital step forward. And then a set of implementation challenges, the reality of running these services locally. So recruiting and retaining children and families and services, the need for services to be really flexible and responsive, which creates challenges around outcome definition and specification, and the need to respond to and consider a child's developmental stage. As I say, we think these are all very valid challenges, but none of them are insurmountable, and we still do need to try to generate more evidence at this level. But crucially, we know that it's not all about trying to generate RCT evidence in this space, that context, local context, not only has an impact on our ability to evaluate, but also on the ability to use evidence within local systems. So we've spent some time taking a really good look at what's going on in local areas. So again, we've spoken to lots of experts in this space, had a look at the literature, and done some work with 4 local areas across the country where we've run some qualitative focus groups, we've done some system mapping with them and really started to dig into what's the context for evidence use and evaluation at local level. And this, I just wanted to share with you, it looks very scary, which in a way is the point. This is one of the system maps we generated from one of the areas. And I'm sure none of you will be surprised to see this, but clearly a whole range of different services working or potentially working with children who are affected by domestic abuse. And a raft of system challenges, which are not only undermining attempts to evaluate and to use evidence, but actually undermining system improvement more broadly. So clearly a financial challenge. So the constraints that local authorities are under in terms of funding, meaning that commission services are tending to retrench back to the kind of very high need, high risk acute end of things, and lots of the broader provision is delivered by the voluntary and community sector, obviously often dependent on short-term funding and in a precarious financial position. Demand commonly outstrips supply. And there are gaps in provision. So we identified particular gaps around the provision of long-term therapeutic support for children, for example, perpetrator programs, and support for Black and minority ethnic communities particularly. So this, of course, makes prioritising evaluation very difficult, and it means that evidence use is limited. We at EIF, we often use this framework, which some of you may know, which is Susan Mickey's behaviour change framework. So the theory that for behaviour to change, people have to have the capability, motivation and opportunity. So in this case, using evidence or evaluating, we've applied this framework to really think about, well, what's happening in local areas? What does evidence use currently look like? And what are some of the factors that are influencing that? So yeah, we found evidence use, as I said, can be very limited. So there are a lack of long-term strategies that are evidence informed around domestic abuse and particularly support for children. Because of the constraints around finances and availability of services, there is what we've described as a sort of something's better than nothing approach often. So when making referrals or thinking about service availability locally, a tendency to think, okay, great, we've got a service, rather than really look at kind of quality and what we know about impact. Priority given often to qualitative evidence, to service user experience, to anecdotal evidence of things working in other places, for example, or things having worked over a long period of time in a place. And then when we think about capability, motivation and opportunity, I think a tendency to think about evidence as just being about programme evidence rather than, for example, how can we best use our local data to understand both need locally and potentially something about the impact of local programmes. A belief often in the status quo, so potentially low motivation really to engage with evidence or to generate evidence. Some values-based decision making, so values and sort of philosophical positions of organisations being really, really key here. Funding implementation challenges, as I've mentioned already, including things like level of workforce skill, retention in programmes by participants, access to programmes, and as I've mentioned before, lack of specificity in service design. So interventions being very, very responsive and needing to be and feeling that they need to be, which creates a challenge around thinking about evaluation and evidence use. So we have published a policy call, which I've just put onto this slide, and we are talking to national government about the need for central investment in understanding what works within this complex and challenging context. We don't think that local areas can do this themselves. We think it's incredibly difficult for small voluntary sector organisations to think about evaluation, and that this needs some national focus and investment. So we are specifically calling on the government to invest through the spending review in a long-term focus on developing our understanding of what works. And crucially, this would be both about evaluation of promising approaches, so getting things to that level of being able to demonstrate and prove their impact on child outcomes, but also crucially investing in earlier stage evaluation of the kinds of practices and programs that are being delivered locally across the country. But at the same time as calling for this, we want to support local evaluation. We want to get going here. And we have some initial thoughts. We're scoping our work at the moment, but some initial thoughts about the kind of work that we think needs to happen. to really support service improvement at local level and the use of evidence. So we think we need to do more work to understand how evidence can support service delivery. So how can we align evaluation with the delivery, the everyday delivery of services, and make evidence, turn evidence from something that is, you know, often feeling unattainable at a kind of very high level of investment and so on, into something that is relevant to people's local service delivery and everyday delivery. We need to increase the visibility of existing activity. So it feels to us that there's a real need for specification. So what is going on? Can we describe it? Can we exemplify some of this work through case studies? Can we give a platform to lots of some of the work that's going on in local areas, lots of which is a long way from impact evaluation? And can we start to think about how do we support the development of those kinds of interventions and services, and how can we support local providers and local areas to really strengthen implementation through using the evidence that they do have to do that. We need our work to be user-led. So again, we need to root our support for evaluation in work with communities and through really understanding what matters to them. And then, yes, in the absence of knowing what works and having little impact evaluation, you know, how do we use what we do have? So how do we use data, local data, intelligence, the views of service users and so on in a way that can really strengthen the way services are provided? And again, how do we support that very early stage evaluation? So what are the right kinds of evaluation that can really help at that stage, avoiding applying too demanding an evaluation model too early on? So these are the kinds of things we're thinking about. Yes, the call for investment in robust impact evaluation, which we so desperately need in this space, but at the same time, practical work that can really support service improvement through evaluation and evidence use at local level. And that's all from me. I just wanted to finish on this link, which is the report, that the product really of our work over this year, and you can have a look at, which is a summary of the 3 strands that I've talked about and includes the call to national government that I mentioned. I'll stop sharing. Emma, I don't know if we have time for questions now or we're moving on, but. Are you on mute?
Yeah, I know. The screen had disappeared. Steph, we'll wait until the end, I think, and we'll collect them together. But thank you very much. That was a really fantastic overview of the kind of state of play, and it sets up the other speakers really well. And I'm sure you'll all agree that the Early Intervention Foundation have such a lot of credibility, and some of these messages coming from them, I think, have the, you know, the greatest chance of impact and changing views. So we'll hand over to Hira Hussain from Chain, who will be talking about the potential of open source resources. Over to you, Hira.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I've long attended these events, and yeah, I'm really pleased that I get to talk to you about open licenses and what it is to work in the open. I started Chain in 2013, so it's been 8 years, and I started it because I was helping 2 friends very close to me get out of abusive marriages, one in Pakistan, where I'm from, and one in the UK, who was Pakistani, but you know, I was studying at university, and through helping her, I realized that we just couldn't find the information that we wanted online around her rights, around her visa, how child custody works in the UK, how things affect in Pakistan. And I felt like when I was searching for information, I kept coming across blockers. So either, the nonprofit sector was very much focused around at that time around, you pick up a phone, you call, you go to the office, you book, call the police, and it was very restrictive. You couldn't call on someone's behalf. The person had to call. My friend did not want to be the one to call herself. She didn't know how to express what's happening to her. So I had to do a lot of things on her behalf. And we spent like hours and hours searching for information. And we could just never really, the way the services were structured just didn't really fit in with her life. So that's kind of why once she was settled, I realized that there was a big gap in the online space to create, to replicate all the amazing work that was happening in person, but to make it open for those who might never access those same services in person, maybe because of their immigration status, maybe because of conflict, maybe they're not allowed to go out unsupervised, they're scared, or it just doesn't fit in with how they want to access help. So that's how Chen started. And we produce guides and platforms and digital services for survivors of gender-based violence, all kinds of gender-based violence. And it's a global platform. But since I'm based in the UK and quite a few other people are, there are lots of UK specific work that we do as well. But I'm going to talk to you as if this is, I'm going to talk to you about all of our work because it's useful when it is about, working in the open. So my background is in technology, and I also worked on anti-corruption and how government transparency can help fight corruption and money laundering. So openness has been a very key theme in all of my work. So I wanted to make sure I brought those same values into this feminist space. So here are some things that that people have said about our products and services, and I'm going to share what those look like with you as well. So you can see that there is a lot of trust and with our survivors have with us. So Chen works for survivors of abuse and like non-binary people, and we have, our products are designed around the needs of women and non-binary people, but are open to people of all gender because they're all online. Whatever is online and is unlocked, there's no sign-up form, there's no vetting, there's no checking. So it just means that all of those resources are available. But not only are they available for the survivors, they're also available for frontline organizations. All of our courses, and I'll show you examples, they're just there and they're under an open license. So you tomorrow, or even today, could just go grab what's there, change stuff, add your own branding, do whatever you wanted to it and publish it with just a very one line like credit to saying the original was like built by Chen, link here, and this is our own work. And it will be completely fine. And that's the kind of power like that open licenses unlock in this kind of work. So not everyone has the capacity to hire translators and have resources in like 20 languages. Chen's resources are available in 11, sometimes 16 languages, depending on what the resource is. So, and they've all been not just been translated, they've been localized, they've been written, checked, by survivors of that background. Up to 70% of our team are survivors of abuse. I was a volunteer up until last year. I went full-time, and now we have a small paid team, but we have a very big volunteer community. So it's very much survivor-led. So here's some examples of our work. We have guides like how to build your own domestic violence case without a lawyer. So we crowdsource this with survivors who built it, and then we got lawyers to check it. So, or online safety, we have a bunch of digital services, which I'm going to take you through. And then I'm going to talk to you about why all of this is important and why working in this way is important. What does our impact look like? We've had about 400,000 people and over 1 million page views. Our people come to us from all across the world. What's really interesting is that we can see so for example, one of our services I'm going to show you called Soul Medicine, we can see that the content that's being like the language content that is available is accessed by what countries. So the United States and the UK, for example, are the top countries who access resources in Arabic and Urdu. So we know that these are like diaspora communities who are, accessing that support because that doesn't exist anywhere else. So it's really interesting seeing how those things happen, but there are also some random things that we noticed. So for example, when Chen started, it looked very different. I had started it just for Pakistan and Pakistani women across, the world. But then we started getting views from like Portugal. And I know for a fact that Portugal does not have a big Pakistani community. So I was very surprised, and all of our stuff was in English. So it made me think that there is a gap in the market. And also it's just a fact that, when you put something online, people from the world are going to access it. So, and that really changed the vision that I had for Chen. And then it became more about filling this global gap. Some of the values that are really important in the work that we do is about really honoring people's agency, making sure all of our work is hopeful. People know that they're in tough situations. They don't need to be reminded of it when they come to your resource. And then we have empathy and solidarity with them. And that, most important, that we build trust with them. So and you'll see examples of how that's done. As I said before, most of our teams have built up with survivors. Some of these survivors are, professional women who've been working as, and if you hear background, it's my puppy who's just like sleeping and I think dreaming, and she's just like moving around in her crate. So, and some of them are people who've never had a job, have never been allowed to work, were not able to complete their education, have never used email. But they're joining Chen, they're like building stuff, they're creating like these like tech resources, these like, this written content, they're working with people from across the world. So it's really interesting seeing how we build survivor leadership in the long term through this. So examples of our work, which are all available. So all of you can, again, go to Chen's website, look at all this stuff and use it for your work. It's there for that. We are so happy. I often have people who come to me at events and they're like, oh, this is really awkward. I wanted to do something like Chen, and it looks like you've already been doing it for so many years. I didn't even know about you. And my response to that always is, that's amazing. Like, I want you to do this. Like, go do it. It's there's no competition here. This is like the best, because this misogyny is such a big problem. Unless we tackle like it together, it's nothing's gonna happen. So so here's some guides that have been written. And then Soul Medicine is the platform that I talked about. So I'll just go back for a second. So guides are, documents that people can read. Some of them are interactive, but really it's text-based, and they can be quite long. Some of them are like 5 pages, others are like 50 pages. So they're quite in-depth, some of them are much shorter. And what we realized is that for some survivors, this is excellent. This is exactly what they need. They'll download it, they'll take screenshots, they'll keep going back to it, they'll print it out. But for others, it was too overwhelming. So we developed Soul Medicine, which is really built with 2 things in mind. One, that some survivors might have safety concerns, and actually 3 things. So one, some survivors might have safety concerns, and they don't want to, they want to be able to access this content, but for the content to come to them. So that's what Soul Medicine does. It allows people to just read everything online. You can go on it right now. No need to create an account, read everything. But if you do create an account and you want those courses to come to you on your email, and they're chunked up, so a 50-page document, we've summarized into, I think, 12 notes. And each note is, I think, is like half a page. So it's become like less than half of its size. Then you can do that. But not only can you like get it by email, you can set what time is safe for you, what days are safe for you. You can choose to get fake subject lines like, 60 ways Beyonce rules the world or something like that. And so that's the first like user need. The second one was, we, as a bilingual person, and like our team lead was a refugee, and she was noticing this need in her community as well, is that you often want to access things in 2 languages because you want to be able to like read things in your own language, but then see, actually, if I wanted to talk to, like, let's say a lawyer about this, or maybe someone like my new like friend who is, a native English speaker, and that's the only language they speak, how do I express my experience? Like, what is the correct phrase? So to be able to see 2 languages side by side. So that was another like reason why we did this. And third, just the reason why we started, that there's a lot of content out there, and for some people, they just want to know the main bits. So we made this to make the main bits. Now, the tech platform that allows all of this like workings to happen, it's all open source. And that means you can go check our code repository and make a copy and then spin out something very similar to Soul Medicine. And that's not being sneaky. We want that to happen. Like that would make my day if I saw that. I would be so happy. And it has happened some of our other products where people have made them, and it's just really great. Another example is YSM. This is a web application for survivors of sexual assault. What we've done here is we've curated all the content that's on the web around recovery from sexual assault, and also like, some options around reporting, some options around understanding how to take care of yourself. We've curated all that from ourselves and from other people's resources and put them in one place. And this again is open source. So someone could go and create YSM tomorrow and it would be really good. We would love it. I mean, we would love it if people worked with us and we did something together, but that's not necessary. People can just do it themselves. And, we spent a lot of money and time on this. I would say money-wise, this project, just looking at the grants that we received, not counting volunteer hours at all, this is, I think, £125,000 it took to create this web application. So instead of someone applying for funding, getting 125,000, you do all this project work yourself, you do the research again, design again, you could just use this as a template and then tweak it. So that's the power of having open source. Here are some examples of the resources that were there. So my last part I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to move on to and summarize why I think everybody should be promoting, using, creating open licensed products. The Bloom is a project where we have written five courses that are intersectional, diverse, around mental health and trauma recovery. And each of these courses is a book in itself. It's about 50,000 words. Each course is around that. And it's all open. So we haven't put it on a website yet. We're working on it. But if you're an organization who wants to run these courses for your community, you just need to talk to us, attend a 2-hour session. But even if you don't want to attend that, that's fine too. And you can have access to this like really amazing, comprehensive course. You don't need to attend a 600-pound training. You don't need to have a certificate. You can just take that, use what you like or change it. It's completely like the license allows you to do that. In fact, we want that to happen. You don't have to call it Bloom. You really don't have to use any of that branding. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're helping survivors and we played a part in it. And that's what we care about. So I'm going to summarize why I think this is important, this approach of working in the open. And if someone's fascinated about this kind of approach, I also used to write, and I'm going to try to restart it. I write a weekly blog, which are just week notes where I talk about what my week has been like. And it's just talking about like running Chen, what are the things that are happening, and, openly discussing failures, worries, successes, ideas, and again, trying to demystify this idea of like leadership and like chief executives being unapproachable and being this like perfect figure where you can't really see what the decision-making power is. That's not the kind of organization that I run or I want to run. So we have very distributed decision-making. So we put it up there for people to see and ask us questions about and comment and help us make it better. So why should you be working in the open? It creates better ecosystems. I sincerely believe when I started, people would just did not understand why this is important. I often was asked, well, how are you going to raise funding then? If you're just going to give everything for free, why should we trust your work? We need like university graduates to write this, and why are survivors writing this? What all sorts of like criticisms. And the idea is that, again, it's such a big problem, gender-based violence, and there's never going to be enough funding to solve it. And because it's not a problem that can be solved, it's something that society has to work on together, and it's been there forever. So the more we can work together and work on things that other people are not doing. We had a project which we thought we were one of the first to do, and then we realized someone else was doing it way better. We stopped working on that project because we now have someone who's doing it so much better. Why should we work on it? If we work on it, we're trying to work with them. But even if with that partnership doesn't work, the fact that that resource is there and we can just point people to it, it's great. We move on to something that nobody else is doing. And it just changes the way we think about innovation. So much of what we think about innovation is about like, I did this, my organization did this. And I think that ego needs to come out of this work. Also, it creates more accountability. If we put up our code on GitHub, it makes us vulnerable because someone could look at it and say, you didn't do this in the smartest way. Did you think about doing it differently? And that's fine. That's the kind of vulnerability we're okay to have as an organization. And I love it. I posted a job ad that we had put as a template because it took me a long time to come up with that job ad and that recruitment process. And someone had a very good suggestion saying, Hera, I think some of the way you had this interview might be a bit ageist. And I thought, interesting, I had not thought about that. And it was correct. Most of the applications we got were from young people. Mostly our audience is young people. So it was a gap in my consciousness. So that comment really helped me grow as a person and then helped Jen grow as an organization. We're going to change our approach for like that kind of interviewing technique. So it helps. And yeah, just like I think we should make space for everyone to work on these things together. And this is how we create a feminist future, a future which is not around the values of patriarchy, around like ego, aggression, competition. I think these are things that we should banish from our spaces. And funders have a lot of role to play in that. Some other resources for you as I wrap up. So this is a blog that I wrote for Catalyst. It's a great project in the UK, which is all about supporting organizations to create digital solutions. They have loads of resources and events and training that's free. I highly recommend that you sign up for their newsletter and that you look at their website again and again. This blog that I wrote might have some interesting things for you too. And this is the bit that I thought you should look at. When you have open resources, what it allows you to do is to use someone else's work and run short experiments like micropilots. So rather than you spending 125,000 building something like YSM, you could just look at YSM, take its code, and be like, spend 5,000 to test an idea out, and then apply for bigger funding, or just use the funding that you already have in a better way. So, we all have a shared responsibility to use resources in the best way possible and have an abundance mindset. There's enough space for everybody, and there's enough places for all of us to have like differentiating factors. We might have different perspectives at looking at the same problem, and it's a good thing. Lastly, if you're interested in this kind of approach and the way Chan licenses its products, look at Creative Commons, which is where the licenses come. So you answer a bunch of questions, which you can see here, and then it tells you what the license would be. You copy the license code, it's internationally recognized, it comes with the whole contract, and you put that in your resources, and that's all you need to do to license your products. And this is what GitHub looks like. This is where you can put your code. So here's what our GitHub looks like. You can see our chatbot is here. And this is probably not our most sophisticated product, but it's used so much by other people. It's really interesting. A lot of students projects like look at this first and then test something out, build up their skills, and then make something that might be even like loads better than what Jen has. And then there are other, like Soul Medicine is available here and other things. So yes, that is it. I'm really glad that I got a chance to talk to you about this. And yeah, look forward to your questions at the end.
Oh, thanks so much, Hera. And it would be really, really interesting to hear people's thoughts on open source materials. I think it's highly relevant to some of the problems that we see, or overcoming some of the problems we see in the evidence base. Right, so our last presenter is Claire Powell from UCL, and she's going to be talking about a project on developing core outcomes. So over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Emma. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, hopefully you can see those. So Thank you for having me today. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the evidence and what we can do about it, and hopefully it'll tie in with some of the things that Hera and Steph were both talking about. So I'm going to talk about three things. So the current problems with sort of intervention and clinical research in general, so all types of clinical-based research, the extra challenges that domestic violence focused research faces, and some of this ties in with what Steph was talking about. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the project that we're working on around developing core outcome sets and how this might address some of these problems. So one of the huge problems in all clinical research is that 85% of it is wasted, which is quite a shocking amount. And this is for lots of reasons. So it's how it's reported, people overstate the benefits, or they don't report or publish it at all. And actually there's quite a lot of work in kind of open access to research, which fits in very nicely with what Hera was talking about in an attempt to kind of really try and address this through making everything publicly and freely available. There's lots of problems with designs around sample size and how they're analysed. And also there's a lot of irrelevant research. So either people aren't answering questions that are of any interest to people who might use the evidence. So whether that's service users or practitioners or policymakers. And a shocking amount of research is also done without grounding itself in the previous literature. So it's either sort of replicating it or not building on that knowledge. There's a lot of problems, as you can imagine, with research wastage. So we don't necessarily know which interventions work or don't work. And equally, we don't know which interventions might cause harm. Often it means that interventions don't work for specific groups of people. They've only been tested on a small group of people, so they might not work for children of different ages, for minority groups, or any families with additional needs. And we just don't know whether they work or are even suitable for people. And in terms of kind of the bigger picture, this means that, you know, the little funding that's available isn't directed towards what's most effective or useful. And a big part of this is about the outcomes that we choose to measure to see whether they're effective or not. So a lot of them, and I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail, are irrelevant to service users, and they're also irrelevant to anyone outside of research. They're often badly measured. So either very complicated measures are used, or we use what are called proxies that are kind of measuring something else to assume the outcome because it's cheaper, but actually it's not really telling you the full picture. The data can be very badly collected. Often there's lots of missing data, particularly when measures are very complicated. You'll find that kind of questionnaires are only half filled in. And sometimes it's not even agreed how we're defining the outcome or how we're assessing it. And then a really big problem is when people collect data on lots of different outcomes, so maybe lots of different aspects of social support and mental health, they may only report the successful outcomes, so the ones that showed a positive change. So it means we don't see the full picture, and equally they won't report any adverse outcomes, so any kind of harms or kind of when things get worse as a result of an intervention. And then there's the interpretation that it may be that we bring together the results of these measures and we're making assumptions that aren't really based in what the intervention is doing. But there are some additional challenges for domestic violence intervention studies. And actually outcome inconsistency is a really, really big problem. So this is just a summary of 3 of the main systematic reviews in the area. So one of the earliest ones in 2014, which was a review of interventions for pregnant women, highlighted that actually a lack of consistency in what they were reporting and how they were measured was a really serious problem. So even really kind of key outcomes such as depression or the experience of violence, they were reported and measured in lots of different ways that made it completely impossible to compare interventions with each other. The following year, there was a systematic review of advocacy interventions. And again, they found the same problem that actually everyone was using different measures. And then the most recent one, which was actually looking at a very specific type of support, so psychological therapies, where you might think that perhaps they use a similar pool of measures. In the 19 studies that looked at depression, they used 8 different measures. So again, it was very difficult to compare which ones were more or less effective. The other really big issue, which is what we're trying to address, is that actually what we measure and what we decide as a sign of success in intervention is decided by researchers. So it depends on what researchers are interested in or the measures that they have designed. So, and this is based on Emma's work, but what you find is in trials for domestic violence interventions, there's a real focus on children's symptoms and diagnoses. So things like externalizing and internalizing problems. When you talk to professionals, they're interested in these outcomes, but they're also interested in wider aspects of mental health, outcomes around schools, employability and coping. When you talk to the children who take part in the interventions, you can see actually they describe what they see as measures of success very differently. So some of the examples are no longer needing to talk about what happened, a sense that the experience no longer defined them, feeling less emotional and less stressed. And you can really see that these things aren't captured in what we're currently measuring in trials if we focus on sort of symptoms and diagnoses. And the mothers were really interested for their children in kind of happiness, do their children feel empowered, and whether their children feel safe. And the other problem is that some of the things we're trying to measure in domestic violence intervention studies are actually quite difficult. So when we think about safety, which is obviously really important, how we measure and how we conceptualize safety and safety planning is actually very complicated. It depends at what point in someone's kind of journey, either through services or through their experiences, that will make a really big difference on what we measure and how. If someone is using more safety planning, we don't know if that's to do with a change in the violence or as a result of the intervention, or that perhaps overall their well-being has improved, which means they're more able to do some of these things. Likewise with social support, there's lots of social support measures out there, but a lot of them aren't really specific to what you might be important or need in terms of domestic violence. And then the same with violence as well. Even when studies use the same measure, they use it in very different ways. People respond to the measure in different ways, and researchers interpret it in different ways. And then within the DVA sector, and this sort of builds on from what Steph was talking about, actually on the whole, the DVA sector don't routinely use outcome measurement tools for a whole host of reasons. You know, they're expensive, they're not necessarily, they don't work for them. And even when they do, they use lots of different tools, and it's mainly qualitative feedback. So a quick recap. Research wastage is a massive problem, and this has implications for services and how they're funded. At the moment, outcomes currently measured in studies aren't defined or match service user or practitioner priorities, and the outcomes themselves are really challenging to define and measure. So one possible way is to develop what's called a core outcome set. So this is an agreed minimum set of outcomes or outcome measures. And all that means is it's kind of 3 or 4 outcomes that everyone thinks is important. So in this case, it would be survivors of violence, practitioners, policymakers and researchers, service developers. So everyone thinks that these are the most important things rather than one group dominating what's measured. And there's a manualized process, and this has been done in lots of areas of medicine and kind of surgical procedures. And the whole point is to really bring together everyone's priorities so that you have at the end this consensus. And they're useful because everyone agrees, which means everyone is kind of invested in using these sets. And it means that actually in any study or trial, all of this small group of outcomes are reported. Which then means now you can start to compare interventions properly. And then it means that for funders, they can make much better decisions about what to fund. So this is our overall project. So we're tying it in with a sort of cost effectiveness project, but we're doing what's in the orange circle. So we've collected lots of evidence and done lots of consultations to develop a long list of all the sort of measurement and outcome areas, either that are currently measured in studies or that people would like to be measured and aren't currently. So we've had, I think, nearly 1,000 outcomes came out of our rapid reviews and consultation process, and we've organised them into different categories or domains to sort of make sense of it. And this is now forming the basis of our Delphi process, which is basically a survey designed to reach consensus. You sort of gradually eliminate items as people prioritise and vote on them. And we've got, or we will have 3 panels of participants. So one panel will be survivors, one panel will be practitioners and policymakers, and one panel will be researchers. And that way we can really ensure that each group has equal input, and we're going to try and prioritise the survivor voice at each stage of this as well. where we are now. So I'm just going to share some initial findings with you. So this was from our kind of consultation and literature process, and this is from our long list of outcomes, so all of the possible outcomes that people are interested in. So first off, children's mental health outcomes. The blue bars show the outcomes that are currently measured in the trial literature. So you can see there's overall mental health, there's sort of trauma, anxiety, depression, and irritability. The orange bars show you what's measured in other types of literature, whether it's grey or qualitative, or they were mentioned through our stakeholder consultation or in interviews. So you can already see that in terms of mental health outcomes, if we just focus on the trial literature, it's a very narrow range that doesn't capture what everybody is interested in. And this becomes even more stark when we look at other types of outcomes. So if you look at the family support, so family support is measured and is seen as important. But actually, there are lots of other subtle types of kind of family support related outcomes that aren't captured in the trial literature that people think are important. So we have family relationships with friends, the extent to which a family feels part of the wider community, social isolation, and fear of social judgment. And these are all things, you know, that are currently missed. And likewise for safety, another very important outcome. So at the moment, the only thing that's sort of measured in the trial literature is the ability to safety plan, but there are all of these other outcomes here that others have identified as being very important. So around feelings of fear, the risk of harm, access to safe spaces. So you can see from that if we go beyond the trial literature, we find that there's a whole range of much more nuanced outcomes that are important to survivors and practitioners. And our hope is by including all of these in our Delphi process, we can reach consensus amongst all of the stakeholders. And what we really hope that will mean is that the final core outcome set will be useful for both research and practice to really try and bring these two at the moment quite separate areas together. So, implications for all of you. If you would like to participate in our eDelphi, we are still welcoming people to take part. So if you have lived or professional experience of domestic violence or child maltreatment, because we're running a parallel process, get in touch. Or if you know people who you think would be worth they take part, again, get in touch. If you come from a practice background, it might be, we'd really welcome you thinking about using your core outcome set, because it's only worth doing if people are going to use it. If you're at a sort of service lead or commissioning side, you could think about whether you're interested in feeding back on our outcomes taxonomy or using the COS. And if you're a researcher, you know, you might want to think about whether you could use our COS in future studies when it's completed. And that's everything, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. It's an amazing presentation as usual. So we're running to time, and now we have a panel discussion. So if I just give people 2 minutes to think about any questions that they may have. It doesn't need to be a question, it can be a reaction, because some of the things that are being presented are kind of maybe new ideas in terms of overcoming the dearth of evidence. And, you know, it may feel like a good idea or it may feel problematic. So it's useful to get reactions as well as questions. So I'll just give people a couple of minutes. Yeah, we'll be posting the presentation slides on the website. All 3 presenters have come up with really beautiful slides. Always nice. Any questions? So while you think, I'm going to come up, I'm going to ask Kira a question. Actually, this is something that I am interested in. So, and if all our speakers can put on their cameras actually while we're doing the panel. So Kira, I was just wondering, so this kind of sort of openness to adaptation and taking things forwards for yourselves, how do you make sure that that feeds back in, and how is there a quality control kind of mechanism, or how do you adapt then your own kind of source materials to take account of new and evolving evidence?
That's a great question. It's definitely something that I'm working more on. Running 10 as a volunteer, it was hard to prioritize. This was definitely not on a priority list, thinking about like the feedback loop coming back. But the way it works at the moment is that our survivor team our team is very diverse. So whenever they work on a project, we have viewpoints from different cultures, countries, age groups. We put that together, then we ask them to like consult with their like friends and family, send it to people that they trust. We send it to professionals and our organizations who also work in this area. They check it out, we get their feedback on it. With all of our mental health stuff, it gets checked by a trauma-informed therapist for sure. For other stuff, which is more where we think that we don't need that level of expertise for that, they're checked by partners in the spaces, and then we publish it. And oftentimes if we're unsure with something, we'll publish it as a Google document and then get like public feedback and then incorporate that. So there's multiple rounds of incorporation. And then people often say, hey, you've got this thing there, this has not changed, can you correct it? And then we'll go and correct it. So I think of it like Wikipedia. It's like everybody plays a part in making things accurate, better, and more inclusive. So our language also changes over time when we think, okay, actually we should start using more like, we should not use ableist terms. So then we go back and we look at what we've done and we should change that. So yeah, it's a pretty, I would say, flexible process. There's not a routine to it yet, and which is what I'm working on. So now that I have more time to actually think about this, we have two goals. We've just hired a movement builder who's going to be focusing on the feedback loop coming back from organizations. From survivors, we think we get pretty active feedback. So, but it would be nice to have a more clear route for organizations to say, we're using this that you've produced, we think it could be better by this, or this is what we've done with it, would you like to see? And then we can do that. So that link isn't there yet. You're on mute.
Never get the hang of it. Are there examples from other fields where open source resources have resulted in kind of demonstrable change in terms of collaboration or harmony in terms of what's available, or incremental work?
Absolutely. I mean, this has been my entire career. So I have so many examples. I mean, the best example that I can give you is that, the way the way humans and governments and organizations deal with disasters is done through, a lot of it is done through OpenStreetMaps rather than Google Maps. And OpenStreetMaps is a geological open source project. So, and especially for remote areas where, you have to enable a volunteer community to go and map, like mountains and rural communities. And if there's a wildfire there, if there's an earthquake there, it came in hand in Haiti when the catastrophe happened there. So OpenStreetMaps is a really good example of that, and on the other hand of the OpenStreetMap like space, you have What3Words, which is like a closed solution, and which our government is actually working with, which is kind of disappointing. So it's like, I think that's kind of that those are the two like ends of it. Other examples, when in the open data space, all the way from how you report, how your tax systems are organized, how governments collect like parking fines, all of these things use components that are open. So even companies like Google and Facebook will incorporate some open elements, or will make some of their products open for developers so they can improve. But in terms of like the gender-based violence space, that's definitely not common. There are a couple of organizations that I would recommend that are doing this. So I was very inspired when I started by Harassmap in Egypt, and they were releasing open data. Now Safe City, they collect data on sexual harassment, and they make it open across the world, and as open data, they anonymize it, they release it, and governments and police and city planners, urban planning departments are able to use that and looking at safer cities. So that's a really good example of how to use that.
Amazing, thank you. So Sarah M has a question for Claire. There seems to be consistent focus on what can be deemed as negative outcomes, so e.g. poorer mental health, to what extent are you looking at more positive outcomes such as resilience, participation in physical activity?
Yeah, we've got all of them. We've probably got every outcome that you can imagine. So it's been quite difficult because some people, when they participated in our workshops or in our interviews, they would frame them kind of in a negative way. So kind of, yes, around poorer mental health, for example, or about reducing social isolation. But we do have the kind of more sort of either empowerment, hope for the future, resilience. It's just been quite difficult knowing exactly how to word them and how to group them. So we've tried to stay close to people's words whilst also grouping them together in a coherent way. But yes, we do have kind of everything you can imagine, I think.
But I think probably from, I mean, Claire, you know the outcomes better than me, but as Sarah kind of mentions, there does seem to be a kind of propensity to focus on deficit rather than things like hope.
Yeah.
Things that
So
are
yeah, and I think that's definitely what comes out of the trial literature. It's very deficit based, and actually what we hear from survivors and practitioners is that, you know, they'd rather it was about strengths and going in a positive. So, you know, we hope that that's what will come out of the consensus process, because actually that's probably a more useful way of measuring what's effective.
Great, thank you. And Steph, I had a question. So thinking about moving forwards and thinking about more government funding for this space, to me that seems, I mean, that would be amazing, but it's only a partial answer in the sense of, you know, there are people that deliver services and develop services and policymakers, but there are also people who have expertise in researching services. So how do we bring those people together, and can you do that under the auspices of kind of governmental organisation? Do you see what I mean? How do you facilitate that better coordination?
Yeah, interesting, Emma. I mean, I really agree with that. So, you know, what we don't want to see again is kind of government funding that's very centrally directed and is not true. You know, this needs to be truly a collaborative effort between researchers, between the kind of end users of evidence, as we think of them, so the people actually trying to make a use of evidence. We need to make research and evidence useful to people. I think we can't, realistically, we can't do it without some government investment, but yeah, not kind of centrally directed. I think investment into just that kind of partnership set up between researchers, end users, potentially kind of intermediary organizations like ours, so that we can really think about how research answers the questions that people have and doesn't start from a kind of top down, you know, here's a thing that we want to test whether it works, and then we just think somehow this could be scaled up across the country. You know, I think active engagement with what's really happening in local areas and in local services is crucial.
I'm really sorry. I was like looking for your questions in the chat box, but we actually have a special Q&A box that Anjali has just had to direct me to. But this is great because we have another 25 minutes to talk about, you know, to read your questions. So, Daniela says, often researchers face the barrier of engaging with survivors. Claire, any thoughts on how to facilitate engagement of survivors and children in research? And obviously, and this is something that Hera is able to do, feeding into her resources as well. So Claire, if you take that first, and then Hera, if you've got any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, we'd have something more along the lines of Hera, where we'd have a team of survival researchers and it would start at the beginning like that. But when that doesn't happen, what we've done is we've tried to invite people to take part in lots of different ways. We've had lots of different ways that survivors can take part, and we've actively gone out to try and invite and encourage different groups of survivors to take part. You can't wait for people to come and take part. So we started off through contacts that we knew and doing sort of open invitations to workshops. Through the people we attended, we invited other people, we spoke to organisations who attended, so survivor-led organisations, and we've consulted with them to make the process as kind of open and accessible as possible. And I think our kind of consultation with a couple of key groups has really helped us make sure that we're not missing people, that we're as inclusive as we can be. But yeah, it's taken a lot of time, and we've had to approach lots of groups, and obviously with the pandemic, that's been incredibly difficult because everyone's very stretched. But we do have some groups we've got some very good relationships with, and they've seen the value of this project, and they have then helped us reach more people. But I think it's about being really flexible and making sure you don't exclude people. So, we did interviews. People could take part in any way that they wanted. So they could either answer the questions by email or by phone or by video call. And it's just making sure you have lots of options. So it's as easy as possible for people to take part.
Kira, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I would say, to add to all the things that Claire has said, and this might not really be what the academics in this room will like, but I think being creative in the way you gather like information is so key. So, whether it's a survey, I mean, the usual stuff, survey, interview, of course. But then I think other things like for one of our research, we just looked at the comments that people had left on Facebook. We just asked on a couple of Facebook groups saying, hey, we're doing research, here's what's happening. I want to know what has been your experience. And so many people are so willing to give. And I think the important thing is that there's a lot of fatigue, research fatigue with the organizations. We almost always say no if a researcher approaches us, because the research methods can be so extractive, and it's not clear how all this research that everybody seems to be doing on the same thing. Again, the thing about replicability is so much research on the same stuff. It just feels reductive to kind of get your community involved in them again and again. I think that other creative solutions that have worked for us have been around just observing people, and asking them, inviting them to be part of the research themselves, which is really interesting always. As it changes people's perspective. And I think that my final thing, this would be something you probably have thought about, but is, whether it's asking someone to keep a journal for you, keep a photo journal, write a poem for you, which explains their experience, like whatever, like different ways you can get some pretty interesting insights. But to always remember that with survivors of abuse, be it a child or an adult, the trauma can affect how someone responds to research questions, because they're always thinking about like, what is it that you're trying to get out of me? And a lot of people might answer to please, because it's a trauma response. And trying and creating like experiences and research like settings where that is so clear that that's not what we're trying to do. And because you can see how palpable I always keep transcripts of all of our interviews, verbatim transcripts, and then just spend time just looking when we're doing interviews, of just observing, and you can spot. So a simple example, we asked a couple of survivors in a group to look through a website we had built, and I mean, some of the stuff that they were doing, I could just tell how nervous they were, because they kept checking my face for micro expressions of whether they're doing the right thing. And it took a lot of us, and we took breaks, we went for walks, someone wanted to go for a cigarette, we were like, okay, sure, no, let's do the interview there, or like let's do it afterwards, like being really, really flexible, and really making it all about them. Some of them wanted to have tea first, so yeah, didn't want to have tea, but yeah, have the tea, and make sure you've got like the setting is really comfortable, so they know that you're not trying to lead them, and you just have to do those assurances again and again. I think but I have lots of ideas about making that stuff better as well. It's one of those like spaces where I think there's so much room for us to do things better. I think I recently spoke to an organization who said they offered children 2 options for what kind of, if they wanted to know about sexual health, and abuse, how would they want to get that information? And they asked them, would they want to play a game or would they want to read about it? And most of them said game. And I asked, my response to them were, how did you ask them that? And they said, well, we asked them that we were doing a research, and they were like, well, a game would be more fun. I was like, that I would never do that research like that. I would always present both options to them in a native way. So you want to see what their instinctual response is. You have lots of things on the table. They're actually discussing something. What is the option that they go towards? because when you ask someone a question, they're already in the research mindset. So yeah, just a couple of things that I've noticed.
Brilliant, thank you. And there have been a couple of questions around kind of cultural relevance and differences in resources and outcomes dependent on culture and priorities of people. So Claire, how is that being reflected in the outcomes work that we're doing?
So we've tried to make sure we invite lots of different groups and people. So whether it's specialist BME organisations or kind of small survivor groups in particular parts of the country that serve particular communities, we probably haven't been completely successful doing that, but I think we're trying to make sure that we include people, and we're really hoping with the consensus process that that's something that people will be able to comment on as well. But we have had quite a lot of outcomes already around kind of culturally specific services and about staff being appropriately trained. So the hope is, at least if the core outcome set at this point might be is something that could then be applied in different settings. And it may be that people at the end of the process say, okay, but this works in this way, but we might need to add this extra outcome. So the final process is a workshop. We get the results of our survey, and there's a long discussion process to really unpick it and make sure that it applies to everyone. So hopefully that will also be discussed in our final thing as well. I mean, at this point we don't know, but we are trying to do what we can.
And what do you think the potential is for using some of the mechanisms that Hira's talked about? So this, as far as I understand it, a core outcome set can't be a static, closed thing forever. It needs to be evolving and reviewed at different points. So do you think that there is some scope for actually kind of using some of the things that we've heard about, so gathering comments and feedback or people's experiences of using it and kind of incorporating that as we go along?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I think research and these kinds of outputs need to be as open access as possible, and it needs to be in a very similar way. It needs to be out there, people comment, people use them, because yes, it will change over time. It'll be different for different communities. Yeah, ideally we'd have some kind of central hub that people can use it and see how it works for them. And I suppose, just to be clear, our process is only about the outcomes. We're not saying how they should be measured. And that, is a whole different piece of work. And again, that will really depend, how do we make that as inclusive and applicable for everyone as possible, which is a whole other piece of work.
I'm just checking back to the Q&A box. Sorry, I'm going between the two things. Claire, you raised the issue around different psychometrics used for measuring certain outcomes. Will you make recommendations in terms of which assessments would be best to use?
No, we won't, is the short answer. So, I mean, that's just what we're just specifying what should be measured, not how. And, we may try and get funding to try and do that, but that's a whole other piece of work. And I think, that needs a lot of thinking about as well, because it's, we may all agree what should be measured, but how it should be measured actually needs a lot of thinking about, is it inclusive and appropriate for everyone? As someone's made a comment. So that would need to come in at that point rather than now. We're just interested in what at the moment.
And if I'm checking between the boxes, but while I'm doing that, Steph, if I could ask, so often I've asked about joining up research and practice. And I think, us as part of the research community are very quick to say what practice might be able to do to make things easier. I mean, what barriers are there that are specific, that are emanating from the research environment, and how can you talked in your presentation about doing things that were less resource intensive but still robust. What should we be focusing on to be able to do kind of real world evaluations that give evidence around impact?
Yeah, I mean, we're on a journey with this, and I think this is absolutely right. We can tend to sit, and as a What Works Centre as well, and take a kind of linear approach, I guess, to research production and use. to say, if only we can prove that these things work, then we can just somehow sort of send that information out to people, and it will kind of magically result in change in local places. And, you know, of course, we know that it won't, and we know that there are sort of complex interactions between research and what's actually happening, and that context is absolutely crucial. And I think, you know, as researchers or sort of intermediary organisations like ours, we need to get much better at meeting people where they're at. So some of those thoughts I offered in my presentation about kind of working with local communities, with local places, and, you know, Hera's points actually about just being creative and innovative, but crucially sort of starting from the question, what are you trying to do as a service provider, as a local authority, as a commissioner, you know, what are you trying to do? And then thinking creatively, okay, so what kinds of evidence, what sources of evidence, what kind of data, what kind of information, knowledge, broader knowledge can help you to make those decisions. As an organisation like ours, I think that's increasingly the space we need to be in. How can we facilitate the use of evidence that is meaningful, that answers the questions you have, that works for you in your local context, that doesn't sit somewhere over here as, you know, trial evidence that is kind of nigh on impossible for you to use in your local context. So I don't think we have all the answers yet, but I think we're moving far more into the space of thinking about how can we make evidence work for local service improvement, essentially.
And there's a question, Claire, from Samir. Oh no, I've just asked that one. Sorry, there was a question that is from Nimra. I'm not sure that I'm saying that right. I'm working towards developing an intervention for parental responses to child trauma, highlighting the importance of making services and evaluation outcomes that are locally relevant really resonated with the goals I have for my research. I was wondering if the COMET outcomes are applicable across different disciplines or areas of research. And do you have any advice for early career researchers to implement this framework awareness throughout our research?
So is that about implementing what we're going to develop in your research, perhaps? Is that?
I think using the actual methodology to develop evidence in other spaces.
Yeah, I mean, it's all there on I put the web link in, it's all there. The handbook of how to develop it is all sort of open access and available. I think there's lots of scope to use the method in lots of different ways for different things. It's a really interesting body of work, so I definitely encourage everyone to check it out and see how you can use it. But yeah, definitely.
And I just add to that Claire and I have found that in looking at the methodology, we've had to do a significant amount of adaptation to work with people, with communities who are potentially traumatized and vulnerable, and that haven't always had voice. And so the adaptations that we have made, we're trying to make available to others who may be working in the same space, because this methodology was developed in a medical health focused setting, which can be quite different. So yeah. So I'll just check if there's any more questions, whether any of our speakers have some final thoughts before I draw things to a close. But I might put you all on the spot and just go around and ask you what single thing we could do to make the biggest difference to the quality and amount of evidence that we have in the space of gender-based violence or domestic violence and abuse, you know, all looking at slightly different things. So Hera, what do you think the biggest thing is that we could do, that you're maybe the smallest thing that would make the biggest difference to the evidence that we have?
Formulating very clear recommendations for people that can be applied. So like Stephanie and Claire's research, you know, it would be amazing if I can apply that tomorrow. I'm sure I can, but like, how readily would I be able to come across it, and how many people are going to go through like an academic paper? Not to say academic papers shouldn't exist, they should absolutely exist, they're so important, but is there ways of translating that into like key insights that can be applied by organizations? I think that would be my question. And of course, I would ask everyone to promote their work, with open licenses, and collaborate and be vulnerable to not being perfect.
Brilliant, thank you. Claire, the smallest thing or the thing that would make the biggest difference in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's about all research being open access and transparent from the beginning, the whole way through, because it will waste less and be more useful.
Brilliant. And to end, Steph?
Yeah, I think for me, it's this thing about making research really relevant for service improvement and for the things that people want to achieve locally. No small thing to achieve, but we need to be far more in that space.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So on that note, I'll draw, because we've kind of run out of questions, so I'll draw the webinar to a close. It's lovely to see that people are putting their contact details in and connecting with people. Continue to do that outside the webinar, and do get in touch with the network or me if you want some help connecting with people that you've seen in the chat, or any of the speakers. And we're definitely here, if there are early career researchers who some of you have kind of made yourself known, and you want to chat through some of the issues that you've raised, then I'm sure that the speakers and myself would be really, really happy to support you. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody.